Okay, so I'm going to tell you guys about some work me and a few people are doing out at the Nereus program with a hub here at UBC with kind of branches all over the world. This talk will also be a little bit of an event on my part in terms of kind of a pet peeve of mine, as well as kind of an appeal to you guys regarding research into sustainable development goals, but I'll get into that as we go along. So academics, people at universities, big, large agencies are very good at keeping a discussion going about defining sustainability. And we've been doing that for quite some time. One of the most recognizable conceptualizations is sustainable development.
There you go.
There you go, okay. Is this one, this kind of 3 pillars of sustainability. So you have the ecological dimension, social dimension, and economic dimension. And the idea is that if you can do well at addressing these 3 aspects together, you kind of have this target of sustainability. There's other ways to conceive the idea of sustainability and sustainable development. This is not working. So this is something I pulled from the New Zealand government. So they actually separate the social, the cultural from the social. So they have these 4 dimensions. This is kind of just to kind of illustrate that it's kind of a fluid definition, and a lot of, I think, work and writing into sustainable development has largely been on this kind of conceptualization. More recently, there's been this turn to think about sustainability more in this kind of nested figure to try to recognize that these 3 dimensions aren't independent, that the economy is kind of a subset of society, which is kind of within the environment. So there's a lot of discussion about how to do this. None of this is settled by any means. Andres isn't here right now, I think he'll be coming by, but Andres actually likes to set these circles within the economy to kind of suggest this idea that it's really actions we take in the economic realm that can really affect the other 2 spheres. So it's, again, just to point out that we've been discussing, how do we conceptualize sustainability? We've been doing that for a long time. Probably most recently, this kind of conceptualization has come about. It's actually called the donut, living within the donut. So recognizing that there's certain environmental ceiling that we probably shouldn't surpass. This is coming from the whole planetary boundaries framework. But there's also these kind of social dimensions we should really consider when we think about sustainable development. I don't really like any of these conceptualizations, to be honest. And I think we spend far too much time doing this kind of stuff without doing work to really explore what sustainable development is. One of the reasons I don't really like these kind of conceptualizations is that they're asserted rather than researched a lot of the time. And they make very clear kind of but implicit assumptions about the relationships among these different variables. So this donut example, basically the assumption is that these social variables only really have negative consequences to the environmental ones, right? So if you can expand these, you can do more in terms of jobs, getting better healthcare, that kind of stuff, and that usually kind of pushes outward. So you're constrained from this way environmentally and this way socially in terms of having this safe space for living. But if you move them, you can constrain yourself more and more. But we know that social dimensions, economic dimensions can actually support environmental dimensions as well. And so just thinking about these issues of sustainability in these simple kind of static diagrams, I don't think is all that helpful. So this is where the Sustainable Development Goals come in. I'm actually a little bit excited about this because, so in 2015, the General Assembly of the United Nations, all 194 member states agreed to these 17 goals for defining what sustainability is. So it's much more specific in each case. So there's specific goals, and within each goal there's a set of targets. So in all there's 169 targets for what a sustainable world means. Okay, there's a goal specifically for the ocean. This is the first time this has kind of been the case on this international level. I'm excited about this because there's no implicit assumption here about how these things are related to each other, right? And I think that there's a huge opportunity for researchers to try to understand socio-ecological systems using this framing of sustainable development goals. And so I think it's a somewhat unprecedented opportunity because now the problem's been framed. We don't have to spend, I mean, even though I think it's important to really reflect and think about what sustainability is, now there's actually a set of criteria for what there is to achieve. And now the exercise is thinking about how do they relate to each other? Like how do we work towards achieving them? So yeah, the dynamics between the goals are unknown. And I think it can set the stage for a lot of good positive research. So answering questions like what goals can be achieved together, what progress has been made towards a goal, where are we? And more normative research questions about what goals should be prioritized to kind of maximize our ability to achieve the goals. How should institutions be reorganized to meet goals? Because I think it's a pretty clear thing that achieving these goals will require some sort of transformative change. So despite what I think is this kind of just unprecedented opportunity, so here's my venting a little bit. What I see most of the time in the literature regarding any writing specifically about sustainable development goals basically follows what I think is as the sprout-up hypothesis. And for me, again, I think this is a rather assertive way to write about sustainable development and less kind of a research or empirical way of viewing it. For me, the sprout-up hypothesis goes like this. If you have nothing, you get nothing. Okay? But if you have healthy ecosystems are necessary to support healthy social systems, so the institutions, the kind of legal frameworks, and if you have good social systems, that's necessary to have economies, such as you see here with this Indian fish market. So that's kind of the sprout-up hypothesis. It's very first principles based. Like, what do you need to have the economies? What needs to be in place? And this kind of thinking, I found this paper that's just published this year, takes it quite literally. So this is actually a paper to discuss a framework for the Sustainable Development Goals that basically uses the sprout-up hypothesis. At the base, the roots are the goals around the ocean and conserving terrestrial ecosystems, and from there you sprout up. If you regulate things well through responsible production and consumption, you'll just grow the rest of the targets. They'll come about. So that's to me the sprout-up hypothesis. And I mean, you laugh, but this is what a lot of the research is, like the research, the publications on sustainable development. Even worse, I find, so this is a little bit of a tangent, but I'm finding this more and more, is that papers are using the sustainable development goals basically to just valorize what they're doing anyway. And so this is a paper I just found that it's in the abstract, they link to the sustainable development goals without describing how their research links to it, or what goals, right? So this happens more and more. When I was doing ecosystem services stuff, I saw this all the time as well. Don't do this, please. Let's do a better job of researching this stuff. So the other thing with the sprout-up hypothesis is it's kind of embedded within the Sustainable Development Goals framework. If you look at the achievement dates for all the different goals in there, by 2020, we're supposed to achieve sustainable oceans and sustainable terrestrial systems, okay? And if you do that, that's going to support everything else by 2030. But gender equality and climate action don't have achievement dates. I don't know what to do with them. The entire time we're supposed to be working together to do this. Okay. So it kind of, again, follows this whole sprout-up hypothesis. The problem with the sprout-up hypothesis, to me, is that we don't start from first principles. We have socio-ecological systems are embedded in. So this is just a kind of a framework that Eleanor Ostrom proposed back in 2009 as a way to kind of understand the sustainability of resource systems. All I really want to point out with this is that all these different dimensions interact, right? And so it's not just that if you get the natural environment right, everything will kind of sprout up magically. It's that it's worth considering what these interactions are. The other thing to notice is that, yeah, literally everything interacts with each other. So it's worth going through the process of figuring out what these relationships are. So for me, actually, like I've been thinking about this. Maybe a better way to conceptualize sustainable development and these kind of is to go back to a really old concept in plant ecology, which is Liebig's law of the minimum, and that maybe instead of just thinking about, okay, let's just put everything in bringing back a healthy ecosystem, you think about the different pillars of the sustainable development goals, right? And so Liebig's law of the minimum is basically that, so you can kind of conceive it in terms of a barrel with different kind of wooden staves, different heights of wooden staves. And so the water in the barrel can only go as far as the shortest stave, right? So he was using it to advance this idea of plant growth is limited by the most limiting factor. I think it might be worth thinking about sustainable development goals in some way too, that in a similar way, in that human well-being might be limited by the most limiting factor. Again, I'm not saying that this is an answer to anything, like this is still leaving out the key aspect of interactions. Basically, I think we should just move beyond just conceptual models. So the first kind of study that I did with actually a few people in this room, a lot of people at the Nereus program, was we tried to think about how do you go about trying to assess relationships among the sustainable development goals. And we put together basically a decision tree kind of framework that you can use in a kind of rapid assessment procedure with experts to think about so what's the relationship with the ocean targets and targets among other sustainable development goals, or any other sustainable development goal and all the others. And so we came up with this framework. It's not perfect, but it's a way to start, right? So basically we set it up by thinking about, okay, what are different types of relationships? If you achieve a target here, it could have a co-benefit with a target somewhere else, or there could be a trade-off. There could be these kind of more positive or negative relationships, or something could be neutral. If it's more positive or negative, either it's needed, the first is needed for the second to be achieved, or it's an optional one, but it can still contribute. And if it is that kind of optional one, it can be what we call context dependent. So in every case, it's going to lead to that kind of positive outcome, or context dependent, meaning there's other conditions that need to be met for it to contribute or take away from another goal. So that we came up with this framework and it gave us seven different categories of relationships in the end. And we applied it looking at these are the different ocean targets, and here are all the sustainable development goals. So the targets, just to run them down for you here, the first one is about marine pollution, so substantially reducing marine pollution. The next one is about environmental restoration. The third is about minimizing impacts from ocean acidification. The fourth one is about ending overfishing and IUUs, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. The fifth one is about achieving marine protection goals, so 10% marine protection across the world, and in every country, I believe. 14.6, end harmful subsidies for fishing. And 14.7 is to enhance economic benefits from sustainable marine resource use, basically. So tourism, sustainable agriculture, sustainable fishing. So those are the 7. And what we did was we used our framework to look to see, where are there more co-benefits, where are there more trade-offs among all the sustainable development goals. And so we can come up with these kind of pie charts showing basically the proportion of targets within these goals that are either co-benefits, which are these blues, or trade-offs, which are reds, which doesn't show up here. But then you do it across all the targets. Okay, so this was a pretty, it's a very simple framework, but it can be a pretty intensive process. But in the end, you can generate figures like this and to get a sense of, okay, which targets are generating co-benefits across the most number of sustainable development goals. What we found was 14.7, the economic benefits one. And then in terms of the most number of linkages, positive linkages especially, it was ending overfishing actually. With the most number of trade-offs being from marine protection, mostly related to poverty and issues of equity. Okay, so if you're putting marine protected areas in place, if you're not doing it well, you can actually have detrimental effects on those things. The other thing to quickly note is that every trade-off we found them as context dependent, meaning that if they're implemented properly, you could potentially avoid the trade-offs. Okay, so that was kind of this study. You can also kind of explore some of the relationships in this kind of network sense too, to see, okay, which targets here, so these are all the ocean targets, here are all the targets across the Sustainable Development Goals that are associated with these targets, and which ones are associated with the most. So the more central targets here would be associated with the most Sustainable Development Goal targets. And so they're, again, 14.4 and 14.7. It's actually the ending overfishing one that has the most connections across these targets in this immediate contribution way, meaning these prerequisite relationships. So ending overfishing, illegal fishing is actually necessary for achieving the most number of targets across sustainable development goals. And if you look at this whole context-dependent one, so which ones have the potential to contribute the most, it's actually the economic development targets. So if you do sustainable tourism, fishing, and agriculture, that has the most number of potential positive contributions across sustainable development goals. So this was kind of our first foray thinking about these whole relationships and thinking about how can you set up a framework, how can you actually study this stuff in a bit more of an empirical sense. And I mean, the thing about this is that already it kind of challenges this whole sprout-up hypothesis, right? Because the most relevant targets are not specifically environmental. They're ones that, in terms of the economic benefits one, it's a more economic and infrastructure-based target. And in terms of fisheries, fisheries kind of takes into account all 3 of the ecological, social, and economic dimensions. Just to kind of go further with this, what we're starting to do is work with the UNDP a little bit on trying to link up these sustainable development goals with national biodiversity strategies and action plans. So with the Convention of Biological Diversity, each country around the world has a set of these NBSAPs. And the intention is to help achieve sustainable development goals and the biodiversity HE targets. Basically linking up every NBSAP all around the world and linking them to specific sustainable development goals, right? So again, you can kind of think about this kind of network structure to do this. And I should also say that I kind of ran this for the Guatemala example. That's why Guatemala is up there. I should have said that. But so for Guatemala, so all all their NBSAPs related to the ocean are up here, okay? But all of them except one are associated with marine restoration, and one is associated with marine protection. So if we consider just primary effects, they're leaving out the rest of the 5. If we consider secondary effects, they are addressing pollution, minimizing ocean acidification impacts a little bit, overfishing, and economic development things a little bit, but they're not addressing their harmful subsidies at all. So as we go forward, and as we work more with the UNDP, we're hoping to do this kind of stuff basically around the world. Oh yeah, okay. Okay, so in kind of zooming into a national context, last month, no, September, I was invited down to Aruba to help with their national policies. They actually have, their national government is actually quite interested in Sustainable Development Goals and pursue policies to help promote them. But again, it's hard to think about how do you go about doing that. And so we went through a similar process down there to really kind of understand policy and sustainable development, and especially the Ocean Sustainable Development Goal. Aruba is a country where 90% of its economy is dependent on tourism, and almost all that tourism is based on beach tourism. So they're pretty interested in the ocean goal. So this is just kind of a lead in here. I'm going to show you some plots next that they're going to be a bit imposing at first. But basically, it's kind of fortuitous because it kind of follows the Sustainable Development Goals circle. They're called Circos plots. I learned about them from genomics work. I think a lot of socio-ecological systems research and bioinformatics and genomics I think they can take a lot from kind of bioinformatics and genomics because both are really high dimensional data. So I think, I just think it's cool. But basically, what I'm going to show you are linkages among these sustainable development goals, looking from the oceans to all the others. Okay, and this is basically what we came up with. So these are all the ocean targets, except the subsidies target, because Aruba doesn't have capacity-enhancing fishing subsidies. So that's that one, and then these are all the other sustainable development goals. The size of these targets within the goal indicates the number of connections to other sustainable development goals, and same thing for the others here. So, I mean, of course the ocean goal is the largest one here because we're investigating the relationship of the oceans to the other sustainable development goals. But within it, again, the largest target in terms of its contribution to other sustainable development goals is the goal or the target around sustainable marine resource use. So it's contributing, and it's all positive for the co-benefit relationships. Those are the blues, and the reds are the trade-offs. And again, the trade-offs come primarily from marine protected areas. Again, to poverty reduction and issues of equity. Okay, so that's the first kind of thing there. The second is we can look at what are the contributions across sustainable development goals. Pretty good in a lot of cases. I think the largest one here is with Sustainable Development Goal 8, which is around economic development, but also with hunger reduction, poverty reduction, and terrestrial conservation. Aruba is an interesting case because technically there is no terrestrial in Aruba. It's all either coastal or marine. So a lot of the terrestrial targets we basically treated as mangroves and coastal areas. So that's why that's kind of strong connection there. But it's pretty cool. I just ran this yesterday, so I need some more time to kind of really delve into this data. We also looked at it the opposite way, looking at the contribution of other sustainable development goals to the oceans. So what you see here is there's much more red, but still predominantly blues. The other thing to note is that, so the ocean targets, there's no real clear larger target, so they kind of benefit a lot, all of them kind of benefit from all the other sustainable development goals. There's actually more linkages this way. So the ocean benefits from other sustainable development goals more so than it contributes to them. And a really interesting one here is that the sustainable development goal that contributes the most number of positive links to the oceans is actually Sustainable Development Goal 17, which is about international cooperation. Okay? The other big ones are Sustainable Development Goal 16, which is about peace, justice, strong institutions. Sustainable Development Goal 12, which is about urban systems. And Sustainable Development Goal 8, which is about strong economies. But there is also strong relationships with Sustainable Development Goal 15, which is about sustainable terrestrial systems. So kind of again, the strong land-sea connection. But yeah, so you can have fun with lots of lines and circles. But so this is a project that's kind of ongoing. I have that data, and I'm working it up as we go forward. And to kind of just give a sense of what we're trying to do at a more national scale. We also put out a report this summer, basically about co-benefits and trade-offs from the ocean study to sustainable development goals. And we tried to really think about sustainable development goals kind of going forward, thinking about how climate change and issues of social equity can actually either impede or enhance, basically mostly impede, our ability to achieve ocean sustainable development goals. The longer we wait on this stuff, probably the harder it's going to be to achieve them, because climate change it's happening. And even if we hit the Paris goals, we're going to have to deal with climate change. And kind of from this base, we're developing a new project, working with the Association for Pacific Rim Universities. This is potentially a very, very large project because we want to address this question of how do you achieve sustainable oceans in the Pacific. Okay, so we're trying to partner with these guys to basically get universities all across the Pacific Rim to partner up so that we can do this kind of expert-based approach to really delve into this issue of sustainability. And to do this, I've kind of framed it in this context of transition management. So this is a framework taken from policy studies, specifically about sustainable transformation. And the transition management framework kind of breaks down policy and policy research into three scales. So the largest scale is the strategic policy arena. So this is basically how is a socio-ecological system structured? Okay, so what are the limits or the dimensions that policy can act in? Okay, and then there's a tactical policy area. So this is the kind of scale of institutions. So what institutions need to be in place? What's the institutional kind of ecology needed to affect change? And then the operational policy area, which is about evaluating specific policy actions and its effect on specific policy goals. So those are the three kind of scales. They're all supposed to kind of feed into each other, communicate with each other. So what we're trying to do is think about a research program in these kind of ways. So the first at this kind of strategic level is to really explore socio-ecological relationships that support sustainable oceans. So again, trying to use that and modify that framework we developed to really look at the whole kind of co-benefits and trade-offs. And if we can then get a strong sense of what are the prerequisite conditions for sustainable oceans in the Pacific across all the different countries, then we can determine what kind of institutional structure is needed to achieve those goals. And then finally, because we're dealing with a system where we're going to have to deal with climate change, and this is something that William Chung is going to lead, is really explore management actions to reduce climate change impacts. So to evaluate a number of different proposed strategies. And so, like I said, for the strategic policy approach, it's really to kind of, again, delve into this whole co-benefits and trade-offs way of thinking about things to really establish what is the socio-ecological system we're dealing with, what are the relationships to each other, what things contribute to and take away from sustainable oceans. From the tactical policy arena side of things, so to study this, if we have a strong sense of what the prerequisites for a sustainable ocean are, or what potential trade-offs can be, then we can start to design what institutional frameworks are needed, what cooperation is needed, what entities are needed in order to really contribute to the different aspects of the socio-ecological system to achieve sustainable oceans. And then finally, for the operational policy arena, is to really evaluate a set of different policy actions to really address these issues of climate change, and to think about both in terms of its effectiveness to reduce impacts or to manage impacts, and its feasibility. So it could very well be the case that you can have a specific action that would be highly effective but politically infeasible. And so we really wanted to address these issues kind of throughout the Pacific. So that's what we're building right now. I'm pretty excited about it. I think Andres is too. Can I get you in on that? So that's that level. We're also thinking about addressing some research and sustainable development goals at kind of a specific goal level. So kind of a persistent issue in socio-ecological systems is really thinking about the relationship of social and biological systems. So what supports what? It's a tough one, and a very persistent narrative we hear a lot of the time is that that biological systems can kind of control the stability of social systems because of issues around resource scarcity and conflict. So we're also partnering up with UNDP for this again. But we know, and this is research that David Gill just put out this year, we know that having strong institutions can really regulate our ability to manage biological systems, right? So this is a larger study that David did that came out this past year, looking at the effectiveness of marine protected areas and finding that the factors that really are very important for marine protected areas are largely having to do with capacity of institutions. Okay, and so the effectiveness of an MPA on the biomass of fish in the MPA was highly regulated again by institutional capacity. So if there was no staff, then impacts on biomass were much lower than if there was adequate staffing. So we know that institutions have a strong kind of relationship with environmental sustainability. And so we want to start to develop these kind of sustainable pathways for achieving ocean targets. Again, thinking about the relationship of kind of more social, technological, and biophysical variables. So if we can kind of think about multiple variables at each stage, and think about which one is the stronger kind of predictor for achieving sustainable ocean targets in each case. So that's another project we're starting up, and getting even more specific, even doing research into specific targets. So this is target 8.7 is actually a very important target because it has to do with human trafficking and slavery. So currently, today, there are more slaves in the world now than there ever have been in history. Okay, and a lot of, I think that current estimates are somewhere between like 27 and 41 million people in the world are in indentured servitude, slavery, and they're being trafficked around. So we're starting to partner up with Liberty Asia. They're an NGO that deals with issues of human trafficking. And a lot of this human trafficking actually occurs through fisheries. So Liberty Asia has compiled this enormous database of of events of trafficking. And so we're chatting with them now about developing this kind of project to address issues of trafficking, both in terms of can we identify major trafficking routes, can we understand like the profile of traffickers. If someone is trafficking wildlife, are they likely to traffic people? If they're trafficking people, are they likely to traffic wildlife? And to what extent is this kind of occurring through the oceans? So issues like that. This one's also, I mean, we have not established this research agenda. We've just started the kind of partnership. But just to give a sense that we are trying to address these issues of SDGs at all these multiple scales. So just to kind of, to wrap up, that Sustainable Development Goals really provide a chance to study broad socio-ecological space. And you can really partner with a lot of very interesting and good partners outside academia with it. So it's a very kind of transdisciplinary approach. So you can do this research across goals, and within specific targets. And please do more to help me with this kind of stuff. Because it's tough, it's big, and we really need more than really simplistic conceptual frameworks and you citing them to support your own research. And there's a lot of support for this stuff going forward. So there's this proposal from UNESCO to have the next decade be an international decade for ocean science for sustainable development. So there's a lot of support to do this kind of stuff, but not a whole lot of people I would consider really doing it. So that's it.
Got a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. That was great. I think just given your analysis and the other pieces of work that you cited, it seems to sort of set an agenda for approaching, reaching the SDGs. It just made me think a little bit about the UN. Maybe I'm expecting too much of them, but I wonder if you know what sort of analysis they went to design the SDGs, to set them.
What went into designing them?
Yeah.
Well, it was an enormous negotiation with all the member states, and they had to achieve consensus. So it was this big multi-party process. I mean, I wasn't there. But like that's, I mean, the interesting thing to me is that they are as specific as they are, and they were achieved through consensus. That's kind of the upside of it. The downside is that a lot of them actually are more vague than you might want them to be. Like I said, for the marine pollution target, it's to substantially reduce marine pollution, whatever that means. But yeah, I mean, the process was that. Like we have to deal with basically what the world's leaders agreed on. Yeah.
I just had, because I was fortunate to be involved in parts of it, so I remember what was, like what you asked of people in terms of contribution towards the report. So specifically with your case study, I was just curious to know, to develop that wheel, for lack of a better term. Who did you involve and what sort of questions did you ask?
Yeah. So
did you do it in a similar way as to what you asked us, and did you include people from all sorts of walks of life, or it was like targeted?
It was similar to what we did for that first study, but it was a set of workshops we did down there, and it was with people from various Aruban ministries, from economic affairs. They have their own SDG commission down there, their environmental department, tourism department. It was very broad, and mostly public servants, because they don't have a lot of like academic institutions there. So we chose people who really knew the country really well, and went from that very kind of diverse standpoint, but in these in these workshop settings where they could kind of bounce ideas off each other. But we tried to have experts in each discussion that were specific to each target. And yeah, so that's how we did it that way. But the questions we asked were the same, and we addressed with the first study. Yeah, again, going through that kind of decision tree. The other thing is that we actually, because we did it in a workshop setting, we got individual responses. So one thing I'm not representing in this kind of first cut of the analysis is the uncertainty, and so that's kind of what I'm going to work into in the next iteration, because not everyone agreed. Yeah.
I had a question about your sucrose plots.
Yeah.
So you've identified lots of connections, but you haven't implied anything about the strengths of those connections. So are there certain things, even though it seems like, well, this is a minor group over here, and it just happens to have the most important thing, which might be...
Yeah, that's definitely the case. I mean, probably the main limitation of the framework we have is that it's not quantitative in terms of the strength of contribution. And that's something that's, yeah, we have to really consider in that, you know, one specific target can connect to every ocean target and do so in what we call a prerequisite way, meaning it's needed, but it only contributes, you know, 5% towards it. So that's definitely the case in each. And so what? Yeah, so we can't really address full importance. We can just get it at the sense of diversity doing this kind of analysis. So that's why we really try to, when we're doing it, we're really thinking about like what targets are affecting the most number. And really trying to have kind of this kind of broad lens. As we're getting into doing this research, the more specific one on the institutions and ocean goals, we're trying to develop a framework to really assess that contribution strength. But that's kind of in development, yeah. But that, like I said, that's something we recognize as a clear limitation of what we've done so far. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. When you were having these kind of expert rapid assessment discussions, was time or like the temporal nature of these kind of goals considered? Not like the achievement date, but if you, like for goals around ending subsidies or ending overfishing, it's we think of them, we know they're going to be good in the long term, but when we end subsidies, there's going to be a shock.
That's a really interesting point, and one we kind of dealt with. And we did deal with the temporal concern, and the way we did it was to actually embed the achievement dates in how we asked the question. So if we said, basically we asked the question, if we achieve this, the way it's said. So with the ocean targets, it often means achieving by 2020. So if you're actually getting rid of IUU fishing by 2020, what's the effect on the targets in ending hunger? And so it's considering that 10-year lag effect. But when we were comparing against other targets with a 2020 target, it's like now we have to think about things short term as well. And so it led to us classifying some things as trade-offs, which led to actually some arguments within our group about long or short term. But it's something we have to be very clear about, that in the short term there will be trade-offs, in the longer term there might not be. But that's how we tried to do it in this kind of first cut, to really think about temporal scale.
Okay.
Yeah. The problem, though, is that not all targets have achievement dates, and so we have to make assumptions about temporal scale in those cases. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, Tiffany.
Thank you, Gerald. And I appreciated that you mentioned that a lot of how these policies are framed relates to the assumptions we make about the relationships between, say, society and the environment, or peace and a proper functioning ecosystem. But I wonder, when you're doing applied work like this with policy, how ready are policymakers to revisit those kind of fundamental assumptions about how society works? Like, is that... Right.
Yeah, when we prepare it for policymakers, I don't get into the whole 20-minute philosophical.
Okay.
It's much more like you know what, this is our analysis. We found if you really want to achieve these goals, maybe you should prioritize these ones that affect across the most. And so it's much more targeted that way. Yeah, I just, for me, the whole first part of that was my venting. That was my pet peeve, which I have yet to write out, but maybe I will someday, but not for policymakers. Anything else? Yeah.
One more question.
So one of the things that falls out of your research, which you sort of just said right there, was that if you have a goal or a target that has many more connections,
Yeah.
somebody might want to prioritize that.
Mm.
But there's also sort of this realistic component of how achievable is the target or the goal.
Yeah.
And so perhaps governments might want to prioritize the lower hanging fruit because they'll know they'll get it done or whatever. And so have you thought of a way to maybe pull that in as well? Or?
Yeah, so again, I think so the analyses we have done is looking at relationships, and so that's, I think, the second limitation of it. The first is that they're not quantitative in terms of contribution. The second is it says nothing about implementation. Like, how do you actually go about achieving these things? It's just saying, if you achieve it, what happens? And so, again, I think as we're starting to develop our research, looking into more specific goals, so what's the relationship with SDG 16, the peace and strong institutions, with the oceans, we can start to delve into that more and more. And that's basically the issue we're trying to deal with that target or with that project, is basically how, what are the institutional pathways needed to achieve these targets. But actually, I mean, that's something I hadn't necessarily considered as the whole feasibility component. So I think it could be good to try to get some measure of feasibility of those kind of pathways. It's a good idea, thanks.